Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, Executive Director of the Church State Council, here with my co-host, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine. Together, we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. Well, Bettina, before we get to our guest, we're talking about a very interesting poll from Gallup that more Americans now, by a slim majority, are not religious. What do you make of this?
It's so interesting, Alan, because this was exploring their self-identity, how they perceive their own spiritual identity. And what really caught my attention as I was reading some of the news stories around this was a press release from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And I'm sure you're aware of this organization, which has a very hostile, position toward religion, especially in public life. And so they were really celebrating this result, which, showed that 51% of Americans now say that they are not religious. I don't know. For me, it really raised a question in my mind as we move down this track. How is this demographic trend going to impact how religious freedom is understood in this country? If religion is no longer sort of a primary identifying factor for Americans. What do you think, Alan?
Well, we're seeing a number of trends, I think. For one, as an attorney litigating these cases, I do find that secular judges are kind of tone deaf about religion and religious discrimination. So I have seen a number of cases where, it's like for the religious discrimination, if it was a snake, poison a snake, you'd be dead because it'd be biting you, right? And then the judges just cannot see it at all. So there's that, and it's one of the reasons, frankly, that in my discrimination cases, I try to have a non-religious co-counsel who can look at the religious discrimination issues from a different point of view than I do, because I'm looking at it from a faith set of eyes. But fundamentally, beyond the difficulty of bringing these discrimination cases, what is the case for protecting religious freedom? And how do you make that case to people who don't really value religion in the first place? That's the problem, right? Because if you think about what religion is to somebody who doesn't believe in God or doesn't believe in, or at least doesn't really believe in religion, at its best, it's a harmless myth. It's the opiate of the masses. It brings comfort to people, right? It's innocuous, but it's a myth. But at its worst, of course, religion has been implicated in war and violence and conflict throughout the ages, and it's very harmful. And we have our own symbol of that in the Twin Towers in New York City, right? Product of religious conflict and violence. So I think that the long-term prospects for protecting religious freedom are very challenging.
It's interesting, Alan. I don't know if you came across a book. I think it was published about 10 years ago by a Chicago law professor, and I'm not recalling his name, Brian Leiter. Leiter, I believe his name was. And the book was Why Tolerate Religion? And one of the questions he asks in that book is, why should a religious soup kitchen get land use exemptions that a secular soup kitchen doing exactly the same work as a religious soup kitchen isn't entitled to? I mean, what is the logical rationale for that? And if you're looking at that question from the perspective of a secular person, a non-religious person, there is no reason why a religious entity should be treated differently in law. And it seems to me that you're absolutely right, Alan. As we walk down this path toward a different future, we are going to face new challenges for making the case for why religion deserves some kind of special treatment in law?
Well, but historically, there's been a balance, right? So, on the one hand, religious activity enjoys a great measure of freedom from government regulation and oversight. But the balance to that is that they're separated from government funding and resources. So we're left alone. Now, that balance has shifted where not only do we want preferential treatment, say, in land use, but we also want not to be excluded from the church, not those of us who believe in church-state separation, to be sure, but want to be included in government funding, but without government accountability, and that's not a reasonable formula. The golden rule still applies. Not the do unto others golden rule. I call it the other golden rule. He who's got the gold makes the rules.
Right. And Alan, that whole idea of a preference for one religious tradition over another, it's actually pretty closely related to the topic that we're going to be talking about with our guest today. So why don't we go ahead and bring him on? So welcome, Dr. Marc Brettler. I'm so pleased that you're with us today. Marc is a member of the American Academy for Jewish Research. He's the Bernice and Morton Lerner Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University. He's also the author of a number of books and articles, including How to Read the Jewish Bible, and he is co-editor of the Jewish Study Bible and the Jewish Annotated New Testament. He also co-founded thetorah.com, which is a website dedicated to making academic biblical scholarship available to the wider public. Thank you so much for joining us, Marc.
Thank you, Bettina. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
So, in recent months, the Texas legislature came forward with an interesting proposal, and it was to mandate the posting of the 10 Commandments on the walls of every public school classroom. Do you want to give us a little bit of a background on that push? What was this all about?
Sure. I assume you had the word interesting in scare quotes there, because it indeed is a quite interesting proposal. And it is a proposal which was not passed in the recent legislative session, but will probably be resubmitted again. And I've heard from my colleague who teaches at SMU, Mark Chansey, who's very involved in issues concerning the Bible and public life, that other states are considering something similar. So this was legislation suggesting that in every Texas public classroom, there be a particular version on a placard, a particular size, of a particular text of the 10 Commandments that says on the top that these are the 10 Commandments. So in brief, that is what the legislation is. We'll probably get to talk about it. It is a very strange text of the 10 Commandments that indeed was suggested there. And I do not find this proposal interesting. I actually find it horrific.
Huh.
Well, it's not the first time we've seen this, but I think the first question is, what is the text? Because I think our listeners may not be aware that there are very significant differences between Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, and maybe among some, as to exactly how they're numbered and what the proper designation is of the commandments.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd start even further back. Most people do not realize that the 10 Commandments appear, or the so-called 10 Commandments. I will always have scare quotes around the word 10 Commandments. I prefer to call them the Decalogue. We'll probably get to that soon. But there are two versions of the Decalogue in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, one in Exodus chapter 20, the other in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and they are not identical.
By a long shot.
Right, they're quite different in many places. The Sabbath commandment is the one which has the most significant differences, but that is not the only place. So therefore, talking about either the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments is highly problematic. Plus, anytime the Bible gets translated, it's going to be translated differently. And some of those differences are going to be simply stylistic differences. Some of them are going to be ideological or religious differences. And you have both whenever the Decalogue is being translated. So the clearest case of this is, again, I wish I could say the seventh commandment, but I can't, because I don't think you could count the commandments, because how you count them, let me put it this way, there are no Roman numerals, obviously, in the Hebrew Bible, but how you count them is very much going to depend on how you view them. There really are a total of 13 sayings that you have that somehow you have to group into a group of 10, but the one around which there is the most translational controversy is either thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. The King James has kill in it, and the version that is being proposed, that was proposed in Texas, a version which only goes back to the 1950s. And I'm sorry, maybe for some of you and some of the listeners, the 1950s will sound like a very long time ago, but as a biblical scholar, the 1950s, it's really like yesterday for me. So that version that was proposed in Texas is a version that was originated by the Fraternal Order of Eagles and is closely related to the Cecil B. DeMille film, The Ten Commandments. There's actually a wonderful discussion of the origin of this in a book by a very fine scholar who teaches at George Washington University, Jenna Weissman-Joslett, called Set in Stone. So I would urge you folks to take a look at this particular book. And there she deals with the history of how this was composed. It sounds like a bad joke, but it is true that the version that appears first on the monuments, which were set up by the Eagles, was composed by a rabbi, a priest, and a minister. We don't know a whole lot of details about exactly how it was proposed. It was a compromise version, but when you start looking at it, it is not very much a compromise version, and it's a shortened version of a bunch of very bad compromises. So, for example, the Eagles Monument does say kill, and that is what the Texas legislation has as well. And it's quite clear that that is not what the Hebrew originally meant, because in cases the Bible does mandate capital punishment and does deal with killing during war. So that's simply a case of a mistranslation. And when this text was created to go on these monuments, and these monuments actually have been discussed in one Supreme Court case dealing with their presence in the capital of Texas in on the Austin state grounds. So if you can see one example of a monument there, and many were set up by the Eagles, who believed as part of their anti-communist ideology in the 1950s and 1960s. This is an incredibly important context. They believed that everybody needs to look at the Decalogue, because this will turn America back into a good religious country and away from the godless communists. So that is the origin of the text. And of course, to fit on a monument, it needs to be shortened. And it is drastically shortened. Of course, toward the end, you have a couple of very short sayings, and those are kept intact. But throughout, for example, at the beginning, and I'm not going to call this the first commandments, and give me a second to talk about this, the Fraternal Order of Eagles simply says, I am the Lord thy God, while the King James Version, which is the main source for the text, and again, this is important to realize, because this is a Protestant text. It is not a Catholic translation. It is not a Jewish translation. And, there have been fights over what is the best translation. The King James Version reads, I am the Lord thy God, who has brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And you can really imagine why you don't have the whole thing on the monument, because lots of people are going to look at that and say, I wasn't brought out of Egypt. And even if they're not part of the Jewish or Christian tradition, then they would certainly say, this has nothing to do with me. I came here from the southern part of Africa. I came here from Asia. This has nothing to do. So it's an incredibly highly problematic shortening of a predominantly King James version of the Bible. And that is only one of my many objections to why it should not be placed in public school rooms in Texas or anywhere else.
So here's the thing, Mark. It was advanced under the banner of religious liberty. But, as you're sort of unpacking the origins of the proposed version of the so-called Ten Commandments, it's clear that it's also bringing in a whole other bunch of narratives and historical ideas about what America is and who Americans are. So is this, or was this proposal, a religious liberty proposal?
I simply cannot understand how it is a religious liberty proposal. Uh, I think it has very little to do with who America was, who America is, or who America should be. There's a great debate among historians of religion about how religious America was upon its founding. And this is a debate. It is clear that if you look at some of the founding documents, you're going to find some references to the Bible. But take a look, for example, at the Constitution. There are no references or even allusions to the Ten Commandments or to the Decalogue in the Bible. That should make, no references to the Decalogue or Ten Commandments in the Constitution. And that should make us very aware of the fact that this was not a foundational document. Also, throughout Christian history, it has not always been a foundational document. The early church father Augustine had some significant issues with it being a foundational document. And indeed, in much of medieval Christianity, the seven sins were much more important than the Ten Commandments. So it is only in the last few hundred years, and especially in America, especially with these monuments. And I'll just remind you, these monuments had an important role. This is just so American in the commercial endorsement of the film that Cecil B. DeMille was trying to sell. I mean, he was a very important member of the Fraternal Order of Eagles, which in its earliest stages has had many members from the theater and the movies within it. So let's not overdo it. And how can it have to do with liberty? Because I can very well imagine, a Hindu student who has an image of Ganesh or Ganesha, an elephant at home, as part of the home shrine. And then this student in class has to see every day that you're not supposed to have graven images. And I think this can really encourage a type of religious coercion. And I could very well imagine, and I've heard stories of this from my Duke students, which horrify me. A Duke student who was Jewish, who went to a Christian private school. Whenever there was a New Testament reading, the teacher would say, "Oh, you read so very well. Can you please read this passage for us out loud in class?" And I can just really imagine similar situations where people who do not adhere to the Ten Commandments of Scripture are being asked to read this material in class. And it would be incredibly uncomfortable. And I'm 65. So in theory, people my age should not have heard the Lord's Prayer in public school. But I know, as a result of Supreme Court decisions, but I know many people my age who did, who are Jewish and who felt incredibly uncomfortable about this. And I don't want anybody of any religion or anybody who is an atheist or agnostic to be made to feel uncomfortable in the classroom. And I think that having these posted in classrooms would make certain students feel very uncomfortable, in part because it'll make certain students feel very triumphalistic. And that's a terrible thing to have in the classroom.
So you've actually nailed why measures like this are so ironic that in the name of religious freedom, they violate the very first principles that our founding fathers like James Madison enunciated that religion is not an engine of civil policy, that it's no business of the state to be weighing in on these kinds of theological matters. I deal with this in the courts that, are supposed to refrain from judging the content of religious beliefs and make a limited inquiry into whether they're sincerely held. But for the state to essentially take a compromised version of the text and say this is what we're going to promote in all of our public schools is absolutely the antithesis of religious freedom. And you're right to really highlight the coercive nature of this.
I cannot say that any better.
So, from the perspective, you've really highlighted the perspective of minorities. I mean, those who did not, who are outside the traditional historical Christian religion, which has numerically been the majority religion in America. I'm wondering whether this whole discussion that we're having now is part of a broader problem, a deeper problem with that we're grappling with at the moment, which is Christian nationalism, which is an attempt to frame not just America's history, but America's present as belonging to one particular religious tradition. Do you think this is what it's all about?
I think it's very much what it is about. I think it is also related to the fact that groups which were minorities, including ethnic groups, will soon be majorities. I think it is related to the fact that if you now look at some of the polls, including the reliable Pew polls, which have been published over the last few years, you see that fewer and fewer Americans are Christians. Of course, this is really something most people aren't aware of the fact, something that really only started in the 1960s when the immigration laws were changed and therefore allowed many people who are not from Europe into the country and really created a much more diverse country than what had existed before that. And also there is a decline in religion in America. Maybe a whole other discussion can be if that general decline is good or bad, but many people who are religious, especially Christian nationalists, I think working with a misinformed view, which you'll find often published, but just because something is published does not necessarily mean that it is right, that the Bible was the foundation of America. And it's very easy to say the 10 Commandments were the foundation of America. And I know some Jewish scholars who say that as well. But just because somebody says it does not necessarily make it right. And again, if you really look at the founders and some of the most significant founders intellectually, such as Jefferson, and one can debate about George Washington or not, these folks were deists rather than standard mainstream Christians. And people should go take a look at the Bible, which the New Testament, actually more precisely the Gospels, which
Jefferson's
Thomas
Bible
Jefferson put together as a result of editing, Gospels which would shock many Christians because these Gospels have neither the story of the miraculous birth nor the miraculous resurrection of Jesus. And it's hard to think of somebody who was a greater founder of this country than Thomas Jefferson. So yes, I do very, very much worry, especially about what is happening through Christian nationalism. Yes.
This discussion reminds me, and I was just working on my presentation yesterday for a sermon entitled, "What is Christian about Christian America?" And my thesis is it's the very separation of church and state, the very principle that the government stay out of the business of religion and leave religion free for we the people to believe and practice as we see fit, so long as we're not harming somebody. And this is the very antithesis of what really was Christian about our founding, was all of these different religious minorities saying we can't have the government uh, preferring and promoting and financially supporting a particular religion because there's too much diversity and we need you to stay out of it. Leave us and our religion alone. And, this is, I think, a sign of the weakness of the American church, that it now seems to need to rely on the power of government to prop it up.
Now, I fully agree with you, and I fully wish that the government would do more to protect the right of minorities. And I must say that the decision that allowed this monument to stand in Austin, which was a 5-4 decision, and it split 5-4 the other direction in terms of posting the so-called Ten Commandments in McCreary Courthouse. I think if you start reading the description, including the dissent by Scalia, whom I rarely agreed with, but he certainly had a very, very fine mind. Even he was unable to fully appreciate that the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue appears in different places in different communities, means different things to different communities. And I would just even say that the term itself is problematic within Judaism. In Hebrew, that is not the term that we use. We either use the biblical term Aseret HaDvarim, the 10 sayings, or the rabbinic term slightly later, Aseret HaDibrot, which means the 10 divine sayings. And this actually has some implications, because once you call them the 10 Commandments, then what you have at the top of these monuments, I am the Lord your God, doesn't belong because it isn't a commandment. So people who have done this have not realized the problem there. Yeah. And in the article that I had the pleasure of writing for Liberty Magazine, I was able to point out that if you look at these monuments or at the chart, there actually are 12 sayings. And I'm really wondering what wonders this is going to do in a second grade arithmetic class, somewhere in the middle of Texas. Oh, yeah, so these are the 10 Commandments. Okay, let's count them now. And that shows, to my mind, part of the whole absurdity of what this and similar legislation is suggesting.
This discussion could go on and on. I mean, there's so many different facets to it. And I'm actually sorry that we'll probably have to revisit this whole discussion again in the future in regard to other states as well. But we appreciate so much your insights, Marc, today. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm sure we'll talk again.
I very much look forward to that. And in the meanwhile, can I just say, if any of your listeners are interested in this, on the site that you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction, thetorah.com, I have 2 pieces on this with a former graduate student, Jed Wyrick, which talk in much more detail on why the term the Ten Commandments is problematic, where it came from, and especially what is so problematic about the Fraternal Order of Eagles text for this. But it really was a pleasure having this discussion with both of you. Thank you very much.
So, Bettina, you come up with the best guests. Marc was fantastic. And, he hit the nail on the head. Really, religious freedom fundamentally is about non-coercion, right? Government not coercing us to believe or to practice or pushing a particular religious ideology. And that's exactly what's going on when you're talking about posting the 10 Commandments. It's not just kind of respect for religion. This is what you should believe. That's really the message, isn't it?
So, yes, it is. It is a message. And, it strikes me that it is not coincidental that this legislative proposal made its appearance very soon after the Supreme Court's decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton, which is really, I think, if not changing our attitudes or America's attitudes toward Establishment Clause issues, but it is at the very least sort of putting a cap on what has been a long process of change in the courts and in the public space about the Establishment Clause, which is a weakening of the Establishment Clause. correct?
Well, I think what we're left with is that the courts are willing to protect the religious autonomy of religious institutions. That's really about what's remaining of the Establishment Clause. But as far as government refraining from direct involvement, whether it's with funding, whether it's with promoting religious speech, religious ideas, there's really there's certainly no commitment among the faith community, it seems, to respect for the separation of church and state, and increasingly little or no interest in protecting our religious freedom from government intrusion.
Right. And, I often say that this new sort of era that we find ourselves in, it's really an expansion of the free exercise clause and the diminishment of the establishment clause, sort of a lopsided approach to that sort of jurisprudence. But those two clauses were designed to work together in a complementary way. That's how you get robust religious freedom.
I'm going to suggest that we need to find a good scholar of medieval church-state relations, because
Right.
what I see is we are returning to Christendom. We are returning to a time when the state had to keep its hands off the church, but the state was subordinate to the values of the church. It was obligated to provide funding and support and preference for the church. And I really see that model is increasingly the direction that we're going in. I think it'd be very interesting to explore that history in a series of shows.
I agree. That would be a fascinating discussion. Let's do it. But we're going to have to leave it till next time. This has been Just Liberty, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Bettina Krause here with Alan Reineck. Until next week, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.